So it's a relatively short parsha, but it's got many commandments. I think it has 51 of the 613 commandments. So there are many details, but there's also some of course, some big ideas here. So we'll begin, as is customary, with the parsha in a nutshell. So we get the big ideas, and then we can start thinking about the details. So here we go. Kedoshim. So Kedoshim in a nutshell. Literally, the meaning of the parsha, the root is kadosh, which is holy. Kedoshim is holy in the plural, because the opening statement is, you shall be holy. Kedoshim tihiyu. So the parsha of Kedoshim begins with the statement, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. This is followed by dozens of mitzvot, divine commandments, through which the Jew sanctifies him or herself and relates to the holiness of God. These include the prohibition against idolatry, the mitzvah of charity, principles of equality before the law, Shabbat, sexual morality, honesty in business, honor and awe of one's parents, and the sacredness of life. So this is not the right order, and by no means is this list comprehensive, but a sample. Also in Kedoshim is the dictum which the great sage Rabbi Akiva called a cardinal principle of the Torah, and of which Hillel said, this is the entire Torah, the rest is but commentary. So what is that? That is the commandment in this week's parsha, love your fellow as yourself. And of course, there's a lot of commentary on this verse, certainly some Hasidic commentary, because it's certainly easier said than done to be able to do what this verse tells you to do, which is love your fellow as yourself. Whoops. So this is the nutshell. Now we want to start thinking about some of the ideas of the parsha. And even before that, let's think about the context of where this parsha appears in the overall journey of the 5 books of Moses, or specifically in the book of Leviticus, the 3rd book. So the book of Leviticus is called Leviticus because many of the laws apply to the priests, to the Levites. We call it Vayikra. Now, traditionally it's referred to as Vayikra, which is, and he called. So it's not, makes no mention of the priests or the Levites. However, at least in the way it's used in the modern way. But if you go back to the rabbinic literature, the 3rd book is in fact called Torah Kohanim, the laws of the priests, because again, a big portion of the 3rd book is regarding laws that are at least related to priests, like the laws of the offering. So even though the Jewish person brings the offering, the Israelite brings the offering, but the offering is actually offered through the priests. Okay. Last week's parsha, we spoke about Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is sort of the essence of holiness, where you have not only the services performed not by the priests, but by the high priest, by Aaron, a high priest. And the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. So in some sense, the book of Leviticus, the middle of the book of Leviticus, talks about the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, which is the inner chamber of the temple, talks about the most holy person, which is the high priest, and the most holy time of the year, which is Yom Kippur. That was last week's parsha. So one of the earliest books of the Kabbalah, the Book of Formation, refers to it as Olam Shana Nefesh. Everything can be categorized, everything is intertwined between world, year, and soul. In modern English, it would be time, space, and the person who observes the time and space, and the observer, right? So time and space is the year, is olam, is world, is the space, shana is the time, and nefesh is the soul, is the observer. So you have here the most holy time, Yom Kippur, the holiest place, Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, and the holiest person is the high priest representing all the Jewish people. That was last week. Okay, now we understand what holiness is. But this week, we have a completely different angle of holiness and completely different emphasis. In fact, many years, these two portions, last week and this week's, are read together. They're separated this year because this year is a Jewish leap year with an extra month. So we need more parshas. So we separate Acharei Mot Kedoshim, last week and this week. This week, if all you knew about holiness is last week, you're going to be shocked, and that's really essentially what most cultures understood about holiness. You're going to be shocked to read about this week. What does this week mean? This week says, first of all, be holy, but how does it define holiness? Not by a certain group of people, the Levites or the priests who are separated from the world and devoted completely to spirituality, but no, holiness is defined in this parsha is completely the way a person acts within their daily life, within commerce, within relationships with people. And that's the definition of holiness. So in some sense, what the Torah is telling us, that the test of holiness is not necessarily how you act on Yom Kippur. Of course, you have to be holy on Yom Kippur. You have to be designated and separate from food and physicality as much as possible. And Yom Kippur is a spiritual time. That's wonderful. But the question is Yom Kippur an escape, or is Yom Kippur a way of influencing you and changing you and transforming you? And the test of Yom Kippur is what happens in this week's parsha. If that holiness could impact all areas of your life. And essentially what Judaism is telling you is that Kedoshim, if you want to be holy, the expression holy, the holiness is defined how you live it. Not so much with your belief system, not so much in how spiritual you are, but how you bring it down into the real world. Last week, there was somebody sent me a article from the Wall Street Journal, and they basically study and they tried to figure out if people who believe in God are more moral, defined as giving more charity and other forms of volunteering and honesty. They test the honesty too. So I can pull it up if I can find it in a moment or two. But what's interesting to me about that article, which follows the study, is that it says that no, belief in God is not going to make you more moral. But if you practice, then it will. If part of your daily routine or your weekly routine is connected to some form of ritual, then you will be able to test and see that people who practice are going to, for example, give more charity and be more honest, etc. So that's overall study. Of course, it's a generalization. But the point here is, it seems to be saying that the Torah intuits this and says that the definition of holiness here is not necessarily Yom Kippur, which is once a year, but it's how do I bring this into my life every day? So that's why this parsha, like if I had the choice to name the parshas, I think I would perhaps name the parsha of Yom Kippur, name that holy, and the parsha of how to act every day in business, maybe I would call that some other thing. But no, we call the parsha of how to act between people, we call that holiness because that's the definition of holiness as Judaism understands it. So that's one big idea, one introduction. Now we go to another idea, and this is an idea that is radical. We take it for granted, so that's why it doesn't sound as radical as it does. But what the opening statement of this parsha is completely radical. Multiple ways. So, but let's start with Kedoshim tihiyu. You shall be holy, for I am holy. So a human being could be holy because God is holy. Would that be radical to the people listening to Moshe speak? The answer is no, because in the ancient world, all kings basically said the same thing. They said, look, we represent God, and therefore you have to honor us, and therefore we have the power because we represent the gods. And if you dare to rebel against us, you're really rebelling against God. And that's what people believe that all the way to the modern era, all the way to the 18th or 17th centuries. But that was the claim. So that's not surprising. What is surprising in this week's parsha is that the Torah in the book of the priests, which you would think would tell you, oh, the priests have to be so holy. The Torah tells you, Kedoshim tihiyu, all of you shall be holy because God is holy. In other words, it's not that there's a person that represents God, but every single person of the Jewish people is holy. Why are they holy? Because God is holy, which means you have part of God within you. So in that sense, it's radical. It's radical not that a person could be holy and a person could be connected to God, but that everybody is. That every person is the priest. Okay? So just to elaborate upon this point a little, and then we'll add some spices, and then we can continue going down our journey. So in the ancient world, they believed that all societies were based on a hierarchy. You had the king, you had the people around the king, you had the ministers, you had the wealthy people, etc. There was many classes of people, and there's a hierarchy, right? Why was there a hierarchy? What was the claim? The claim was that there's a hierarchy on earth because the earth is a mirror and a reflection of what happens in the heavens. And in the heavens, there's also a hierarchy. There are many gods, and they battle for control. And the stronger god and the weaker gods have to submit to the stronger gods. And ultimately, there's a hierarchy in heaven as well. And the hierarchy on earth reflects the hierarchy in heaven. That's the claim. Now, that's why monotheism, we discussed this in the past, monotheism, belief in one God, really undermines the whole system of the hierarchy. Because what does monotheism say? Monotheism says there is no hierarchy of gods in heaven because there is only one God. And there are no multiple independent powers that battle for control and are dominated by each other. No, because God himself, there's only one, and all the powers of nature are but an expression of the one God. So there is no hierarchy above. So if there's no hierarchy above, there's no hierarchy below. Now, that doesn't mean we need anarchy. It doesn't mean there's no one in charge, right? Yeah, you have an army, you need a general, you have you have an orchestra, you need a conductor, you have the Jewish people, you need some people to work in the temple. But that is more functional. That does not mean that that there's a difference between the person in the holiness of the person. So be holy because I am holy is the opening statement of this parsha, but it's also the opening statement, but it's also the big idea is that everybody could be holy, not just a certain class of people. Okay. Now, have you heard this idea before? Well, not in any other book before the Torah, but have you heard this earlier in the Torah? So it's very interesting. Why is it very interesting? Because, as I mentioned, this week's parsha, there are many, many commandments. I think it's 51, as I think I said that earlier. And the sages tried to think about what is the order? In other words, are we just dropping mitzvot randomly, or is there some pattern here? What's the pattern of the mitzvot of this parsha? So what some of the commentaries are doing, and they're saying this parsha is really an elaboration of the 10 commandments. So the 10 commandments are very general. And this parsha, they go through every mitzvah in this parsha, and they connect it to one of the 10 commandments. So this parsha is an elaboration of the 10 commandments. Why is that so interesting? Because let's look at the introduction to the 10 commandments. If you look back, I think I have a book here, a different book. I don't have my usual book. If you look back to the second book, the book of Exodus, and you look at the introduction right before the portion where the Torah is going to be given, portion of Yisro, Jethro. So let's just find the chapter. So let's look at Exodus chapter 19. Okay, but to make this fun and interesting, I want to show you I want to compare. I'll show you both texts. We'll compare this week's parsha to the introduction to the 10 commandments. So this is this week's parsha. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And we said, what is the big idea here? The big idea here is that everybody can be holy. It's emphasized in the beginning of the verse. Speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel. Almost nowhere does it say an introduction to a parsha with speak to the entire congregation. I think the only exception is the first commandment of the Jew. Well, it's not technically the first, but when in Egypt, when God, associated with, it's the first commandment. When God tells Moshe and Aaron to speak to the Jewish people and they should prepare for the Exodus and ultimately have a Paschal offering in Egypt, every person should be in their home, et cetera, et cetera. The introduction is speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel. But it's an unusual expression because it's very inclusive. And what do we have here? Speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy. For I, the Lord your God, am holy. Fine. Everybody is holy. That's this week's parsha. And like we said, what's this week's parsha? An elaboration of the 10 commandments. Many of the commandments in this parsha are an elaboration of the 10 commandments. And you know what? We'll just do the first 2 verses to show you, and you'll see, yes, this sounds familiar. Every man shall fear his mother and his father, and you shall observe my Shabbat. I am the Lord your God. So honoring your parents is in the 10 commandments. Observing the Shabbat is in the 10 commandments. Verse 4, you shall not turn to worthless idols, nor shall you make molten deities for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. That's commandment number 2, right? Honoring your parents, commandment number 5. Keep the Shabbos, commandment number 4, et cetera, goes on and on and on. Okay, so this is an elaboration of the 10 commandments. Let's go back to the introduction of the 10 commandments. Exodus chapter 19, the 3rd month after they left Israel, they came to Sinai. So Moshe starts communicating with God. God is speaking to Moshe. And what is the fascinating verse, somewhat well known, verse 6? And you shall be to me. You is the people. God tells Moshe, if you look at verse 3, Moses ascended to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, so shall you say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel. This is everybody. Rashi says, house of Jacob is the woman, tell the sons of Israel is the men, the woman first, then the men. There's a fascinating medrash about that, and that is that in the first time God communicated to humankind, he spoke to Adam and told Adam not to eat of the fruit of the tree. Adam communicated to Eve, and eventually they sinned. They didn't keep the commandment. The Medrash says, had God spoken to Eve first, things would have changed. Eve would have kept the commandment. So here, at the giving of a Torah, God corrects it the second time around, speaks first to the house of Jacob, which is the woman, and then the sons of Israel, which is the men. So we're talking to all of the Jewish people. What do we say? Verse 4 and 5, I'm going to skip. Verse 6, and you shall be to me a kingdom of princes. Okay, this is the translation. Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel. What do we see? Before God comes to the Jewish people to communicate the 10 commandments, what does he say? He says the entire people are priests. The entire people are holy. And that's radical. That was unheard of. That before God, we're all the same. We have the same level of holiness. And that is something that is said the first time around, the first time we hear the 10 commandments, before the first time God communicates morality to the people. But then this parsha, where many of the ideas are reiterated, I should say expanded, we have the same introduction, which is you are holy, meaning everybody is holy. The entire congregation of the children of Israel can be holy. And that's the comparison, that's the connection. Okay, there's so much to say because there's so many details in this parsha. So I'm a little bit at a loss, but we'll try. We'll make some progress. I'm going to continue a little bit. And if anybody has a specific topic they want to mention, they want to talk about, please raise, or you want to hear about, please raise. Otherwise, we'll try to go through the specifics of the parsha. I do want to spend some time on the cardinal mitzvah, love your fellow as yourself, because that is an important mitzvah. Number one, because as we said, it's the entire Torah. Number two, because it's a very difficult thing to understand how that's possible to love your fellow as yourself, or is it possible? So we want to discuss that a little bit. So we'll save some time for that further down the journey. But for now, we'll try to inch along and see what are some of the themes that this parsha expresses. And the first thing that we're going to focus on is something that I alluded to. In other words, it's highlighting the point that we said in the beginning, namely, that the whole purpose of this parsha is that holiness is defined not by separating from daily life, but could you sanctify daily life? That's the definition of holiness in Judaism, which is very different than conventional understandings of holiness. Okay, where are you going to see this? So there's some laws here. Verse 5, 6, and 7, the continuation, we're going in order. Verse 5, 6, and 7 seem very technical, and it doesn't seem like a very important point. But according to the commentaries, even though it's a technical mitzvah, the message is profound, and the message is perhaps an introduction for everything that is to follow. What is this mitzvah? The mitzvah is as follows. If you offer an offering in the temple, And an offering is meat. So basically, you're having a barbecue. Now, today you have leftovers. How much meat can you eat? Could you imagine if you slaughter a full cow or a full goat or a full sheep? It's a lot of meat. So today you put it in the freezer. What happens if there's no freezer? So you have to eat it quickly because otherwise it's not going to be so fresh the next day. When you eat the flesh of sacrifices, there is a commandment that it cannot be eaten after 2 days. Anything left over of the flesh of the sacrifice after 2 days that you did not eat, you have to burn. It's called notar, leftover. One mitzvah. Another mitzvah, even though it doesn't say so clear, but according to the commentaries, this is what the mitzvah means. We can expand upon it if you'd like. But there's another mitzvah called pigul. And pigul means I don't know the perfect translation, but pigul means it's ruined. This is a very, very interesting mitzvah. This mitzvah says, if I'm standing in the temple slaughtering my animal, and I have an intention to eat this animal after the allotted time, after 2 days, I say, today is Sunday. On Wednesday, my grandmother's coming from Eilat to Jerusalem. So why don't I save a piece of the meat from the animal for Wednesday? That's my intention. I have this thought. So the Torah says, if that's your thought, the entire sacrifice is disqualified. Okay? I hate to get technical, but let's go again. The notar, the first mitzvah, what happened? I bring my offering. I eat the flesh of the offering. I got my mitzvah. If it was an offering that I had to bring, like say a Thanksgiving offering or whatever, I got my mitzvah. Mitzvah has been fulfilled. If I leave some over, that's a violation, and I have to burn the leftover meats. Okay, wonderful. That's not a problem. Here, this case, the second case is actually more interesting. It's more severe. It's like, why? The second case, you say, if I offer the offering in the temple, everything is fine. I did nothing wrong. But I had an intention to offer this animal, to eat this animal after the allotted time, the entire sacrifice is disqualified. I have to bring a new sacrifice. What's the significance? What does this mean? So let's read the verses inside, and we'll see, and then we can offer some interpretation here. So look, I'm looking at verse 6 and 7 and 8. Okay, it may be, 5, 6, 7, 8. When you slaughter a peace offering to the Lord, you shall slaughter it for your acceptance. Not a perfect translation. Your desire, you have to want to bring it. It may be eaten on the day you slaughter it and on the morrow. So if I bring the offering today, today's Thursday, I can eat it Thursday and Friday, 2 days. But anything left over until the third day shall be burnt in fire. And if it would be eaten on the third day, it is abominable. It shall not be accepted. Now, the commentators explain it doesn't mean eaten on the third day. It means if you had an intention to eat it on the third day, because you already told me I can't eat it on the third day. So even just an intention is called pigul. Here they translate pigul as abominable. So it's like an abomination. And whoever eats it shall bear his sin because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord. And that person shall be cut off from his people. Very severe. Okay. So this is like the first thing we say after we say the big cardinal things: honor your parents, don't make idols, honor the Shabbat. What's the first thing we say? Oh, if you're going to bring an offering, make sure you eat it on time. Why is it so important? So the conventional interpretation is very simple. The conventional interpretation is you have to respect the offerings. The offerings is a symbol of what I'm dedicating to God. If you wait 3 days and you're living in the Middle East and it's not the winter in the northeast of the United States, the meat is going to become disgusting. So it's not respectful. So if you wait 3 days, you're disrespecting the offering, and you're disrespecting the service of God. That's why it's terribly severe. Okay, that's fine. That's a nice interpretation. It's fine, no problem. But would this require these verses, this mitzvah, to be way up in the beginning of the parsha? And would this explain why even the thought of eating it late would disqualify the offering? I understand why you don't eat it late, because it's going to be ruined meat. But just the thought will disqualify the whole offering. So here's where you get a little bit the deeper psychological and spiritual interpretation. And what that says is as follows. What's the idea here? The idea here is that you have the offering to God. That's one part of the offering. You slaughter the animal, you take the blood, you put it on the altar. That represents connection to God. Then you have the festival that follows. You're supposed to eat the meat in Jerusalem with holiness, etc. You're supposed to enjoy it. In other words, this is the symbol, and by the way, most other cultures did not have that. Sacrifice to God was to God, not to you to eat. We have this interesting type of offering, which we discussed in the past. It's not an elevation offering, which is all to God. It's a peace offering where some goes to God, some goes to me. But this is the quintessential Jewish offering, because what does it tell you? It tells you that when you eat the steak, you are bringing the holiness into your daily routine, into your daily meal. In other words, the food you eat becomes holy, not only the food that's placed on the altar in the temple. Now, this person who's separating the consumption of the meat from the act of the offering it on the temple. Sounds like a small thing, but what does it represent? It represents that there's a disconnect between my spiritual life and my physical life, between the offering to God and the food I eat. And that disconnect is the opposite of holiness. It's an abomination according to Judaism, because the whole essence of holiness according to Judaism, as we explained in this parsha, is to connect the holiness to your daily life. And the symbol is to eat the offering, the flesh of the offering, close to the time you offered it to the temple. So you feel and you sense. And when you're eating your steak, you still feel that connection to God that you felt in the temple. While you're eating lunch, while you're eating supper, while you're celebrating. But if you separate it too far, you're disconnecting the physical part of your life with the spiritual experience. And that is the antithesis of holiness, at least the way defined in this parsha. So that's why this mitzvah is so important that it's in the beginning of the parsha, because it's not just a specific detail; it's really getting at the definition and the definition and the meaning of what holiness is. Okay, fine. So that's the first thing we discussed, and now we're going to move on a little bit, still in order. We're still going in order. We're going to talk a little bit about the next series of commandments, which is you're coming to the harvest, and don't forget to give charity. In those days, the charity wasn't like today where you give cash or you write a check. The charity then was primarily in the form of produce, because the economy, Israel was supposed to be, was an agricultural society. They weren't in Israel yet, they were in the desert, but their vision was to go into Israel and to work the land. And therefore, the wealth was produce. And you're supposed to give some of that produce to the poor. So we'll read the few verses. Again, this is something that was written multiple times, a few times in the Torah, but here it's written again, so we'll read it. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not fully reap the corner of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. In other words, if I'm harvesting my field, I can't completely cut all the corners. In other words, I have to leave a corner of the field with produce that is available to the poor. So that's one form of a gift called payah. Payah is the corner. Then there's another form of the gift, leket, the gleanings. While I'm cutting the produce, some stalks of grain will fall to the floor. If one or two stalks fall to the floor, you have to leave it on the floor, on the ground, for the poor. And we continue the same things with trees and with the vineyard. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you collect the full and individual grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so we have commandments. It's your land. You're cutting your land. You're harvesting your field or your vineyard or your orchard. You have to leave some specific gifts to the poor. Okay, wonderful. That's very beautiful to know, and it's very beautiful to know that that's the definition of holiness. Holiness is not how much Bible you, how much prayer, how much of the prayer book you read on Yom Kippur. Holiness is the yashir of your produce to the poor. Okay, wonderful. Now we want to get a little into the grammar here, because the grammar is problematic, but it's only problematic on the surface. All problems are really invitations to look deeper, and we're going to see that some of the deeper meaning about the philosophy of the ideas of ownership and charity, all this is alluded to with one little change in the Hebrew. So this becomes interesting. So I'm first going to raise the question, and then it's going to offer at least one or two different interpretations for this change. So what are we looking at? Verse 9. Now the problem is in the English, it's not going to be clear the supposed grammatical error, because English doesn't highlight this difference, but in the Hebrew, it's very clear. So in English, the word your is neutral in the sense that your could be individual or it can be plural. But in Hebrew, there's a separate word. I mean, it's a separate suffix, I should say. So you have, I'm going to focus on the Hebrew for a minute. Bekutzrechem, when you harvest, at ktsir artzechem, the harvest, bekutzrechem, when you plural harvest, ktsir artzechem, the harvest of your plural field. So when it talks about your field, it's in the plural, right? Artzechem, your field. Your land. When you harvest, the harvest of your land, so land is in plural. Everything was plural so far. Lo techale, you singular, shall not fully reap the corner of your singular fields. Okay? So we're jumping from the plural to the singular. And the rest of the verse is also singular. Nor shall you singular gather the gleanings of your singular harvest. And the rest, verse 10 is also singular. So everything is singular here, except the opening statements. When you plural reap the harvest of your plural land. Okay, so here the land is plural. On the next line, we jump back to singular. You singular shall not fully reap the corner of your singular fields. Who wrote this? You know what I'm saying? Who wrote this verse? Singular, plural, make up your mind. So there's two different interpretations. One interpretation is, again, written in this 18th century when people started thinking about the concepts of ownership. Well, they started a little earlier, but certainly in the 19th century, this is important. So what we get from this verse is, does the Torah refer to your field as your field? Is it my field? And the answer is, it's not so clear. The second half of the verse clearly refers to the field as my field, because it says your field in the singular. But the first part of the verse maybe does not refer to the field as my individual field, because remember, what does the verse say? When you plural reap the harvest of your land. Collective people, it's a collective verse. When the collective people reap the harvest of the collective land. So you can make an argument from the first half of the verse that there is no individual ownership in this verse. And to the contrary, what the verse is really telling you is that the land belongs to everybody. If the land belongs to everybody, of course, you have to share it with everybody. That's what the first half of the verse implies. Second half of the verse implies, no, it's your field. Because it says, when you singular, you singular shall not fully reap the corner of your singular field. So which one is it? Is the Torah refer to the land as collective? It belongs to you collectively, to all the people collectively. In other words, there's no such thing as ownership, individual ownership, or there's the Torah telling you, no, it's your land. So what is the Torah telling us? Well, the Torah is telling us both. Right? If you think about the theories of ownership is, I own my land, but I don't own it completely. Because in some ways, the community also has certain rights to the land, and that's why they could tax the land. Right? So on the other hand, we're not saying it belongs to the collective, it belongs to me as well. Certain rights are mine as an individual, but certain rights in this land belong to the collective. And that's what the Torah is highlighting. The Torah is highlighting, yes, it's your field, you're singular. And therefore it's your field. We're totally comfortable referring to it as your field. Nevertheless, some of this land, it's the land of Israel. Some of this land, you're sitting on a piece of land that was promised to the collective Jewish people. And even though this is my backyard and it is your backyard, nobody could trespass, but the community still has a certain right to this land. And that is expressed by the fact that we say some of the land you can't, not I harvest and I give to the poor. Some of the land I can't harvest, it's not mine. On the other hand, the land is mine. So which one is it? It's both. There are certain rights that are mine as specifically, and certain rights that still belong to the community. And as an expression of that, I have to give some of that to charity. Okay, fine. That's one way of looking at it. Another beautiful way of looking at it is a big problem of morality. In other words, everybody's moral people. When we hear somebody suffering, we want to help. There's no question about it. Part of the problem is that the individual, in other words, part of the problem where the individual will not act in a proper, kind way is to say, why should I do it? There's a community out there. Someone needs help. 100%, I agree. This person should be helped. But why should it be me? Why can't it be somebody else? And that's a common, I think, maybe I'm wrong. At least I could confess for myself. That is something that people deal with. In other words, yes, there is a problem out there, but is it my problem or is it the community's problem? It's the community's problem. Let the community help. So what is this verse telling you? The verse tells you that, yes, the land belongs to everybody. Everybody's doing the harvests. So I say, I have to help the poor. So my neighbor will help the poor. Because everybody's cutting the harvest, everybody's going to give charity. Torah says no. Even though everybody's giving charity, that's the beginning. Everyone is engaged in the harvest. You have to see, you as an individual have to feel responsibility to help those who are less fortunate. In other words, I can't solve everybody's problem. I only have a small portion of my field. I only have to give a small portion of my field. I don't have to give away my whole field, right? The Torah believes in private property. But the point here is, I can't say it's not my problem, it's the problem of the community. Because we start with the community and we say, don't rely on the community. What you should do is when you, as an individual, harvest your land, that is when you have to give and not rely that somebody else will give, that my neighbor will give. So I think that's an important point because what we're saying here is that don't outsource the responsibility to help other people to the community. Okay. Next step, I think. Okay, I think we can go to okay, I want to talk about the Arla. We spoke about the third. We spoke about the third. Okay, let's go to the famous commandment, which is love your fellow as yourself. And then we have to discuss that a little bit. And if we have extra time, we can go back to other topics. All we have to do is find it. Okay, we're still in chapter 19, verse 15. You shall commit no injustice in judgment. You shall not favor a poor person or respect a great man. You shall judge your fellow with righteousness. This is very interesting. Lo tasu avel ba mishpat. This is a very interesting nuance. Do not commit. How do I translate this properly? How do I translate avel? You shall not commit no injustice. Okay. You shall commit no injustice in judgment. Shall not favor a poor person or respect a great man. In other words, in the courthouse, in the judgment, in a trial, you can't say, well, this is a wealthy guy, so I want to respect him, so I'm gonna favor the wealthy person. Okay, that sounds obvious that would be a moral problem. But there's also a very interesting moral problem, which is do not favor the poor. Don't say, well, we have a dispute between a $1 billion corporation and a poor person. So what's the big deal? I'm sitting on the jury. What's the big deal? Let me just rule that the $1 billion corporation should give a settlement to this poor person. And I go home thinking it's wonderful. I'm so charitable. Torah says you can't do that. You can't give charity in somebody else's account. In other words, you cannot honor the person in judgment because he's poor. You can't honor the wealthy, but you also can't honor the poor. In judgment, you has to be with righteousness. Okay, so that's a beautiful concept. But just a nuance that one of the commentaries point out, the Kli Yakar points out, he says, verse 15 says, you shall commit no injustice in judgment. Now, why do you have to say in judgment? Say, you shall commit no injustice. Obviously, if it's no injustice, it's everywhere. So the phrase, you shall commit no injustice in judgment, implies that this act is good. It's just in judgment, it's a problem. What do I mean? Charity is a wonderful thing, but not in judgment. Not in judgment. You can't tell the rich to, you can't rule against the rich and throw the poor in judgment. Outside the judgment, yeah, it's a wonderful thing to do. The rich should give to the poor. So that's the nuance of don't do injustice in judgment, implying that in judgment it's a problem, but out of judgment, we're referring to something that is actually a mitzvah outside of judgment, but in judgment, it would be an injustice. So that's just the nuance. In any case, we keep going. He says, you shall not go around as a gossip monger amongst your people, called rechilut. You can't go and spreading other people's business. You shall not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood. I am the Lord. Very powerful statement, because remember, in Western society, most Western countries, I have no obligation to step in and help somebody. If I see someone bleeding to death, I have no obligation to step in. It's a nice thing. It's Good Samaritan. If I do, I may be protected, but I have no obligation to step in most countries. The Torah says, no, you cannot stand idly by. You have an obligation to step in and help people. By the way, in Israel, recently, the last couple of decades, I don't know exactly when, today's 74th Independence Day, so it can't be that long ago, but I think it was in the 80s, they changed the law. And they call it the law of not stand idly by. And in Israel, there actually is a duty to report somebody who's in danger. And that's based on this verse in Leviticus. So I don't think they put you in prison if you don't call the police, but at least there is an obligation on the books, the law, which is really a reflection of people's values. If you want to hear more about that, you have to come to the JLI in 2 weeks, on Tuesday, the spirit behind Jewish civil law. That's just a plug. But in any case, yes, the Torah says, you have a moral obligation to step in and help somebody who otherwise would be dying. And that, like I said, that was carried over to Israeli law incorporated that as well. Okay. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, right? Don't keep a grudge. That's what it means. Don't hate him in the heart. If you have a problem with somebody else, go speak it out, talk to them and but keeping a grudge is not the way to go. You shall surely rebuke your fellow, meaning if someone does something wrong, you approach them and confront them. You shall not bear sin on his account. What does that mean? Don't do it in a way that will humiliate him and then therefore would be in a way that attacks him and therefore he won't accept the rebuke. And then it will actually cause him to hate you, and that's increasing the sin. So in other words, it's got to be done out of love. You shall neither take revenge from nor bear a grudge against the members of your people. You shall love your neighbor. L're'acha is really your friend as yourself. I am the Lord. So that's the famous verse, V'ahavta l're'echa kamecha, love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. We know that Rabbi Akiva said this is the whole Torah, this verse. And we also know that there's a story in the Talmud. Maybe I'll try to pull it up right now. Give me just 1 second. Try to pull it up because it's a fascinating story. Okay, famous story. You heard the story many times, but it's good to read it inside at least once. So I'm going to share it in the Talmud and we'll read it, and here it goes. So the story goes like this. There was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai. Shammai is one of the famous sages. His colleague was Hillel. He was known to be more strict. Hillel was known to be more kind, and that is also played out in the story. So there was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai and said to Shammai, convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I am standing on 1 foot. So imagine you're studying Torah for decades, you're Shammai, you're a great sage, someone comes in and says, I want to know the whole Torah while standing on 1 foot. So Shammai took that as a mockery of the Torah. So what did he do? He pushed him away with his builder's cubit in his hand. He picked up his stick, builder's cubit, which was basically the measuring stick that they used to build, and he chased him out of his house. This was a common measuring stick, and Shammai was a builder by trade. Okay, the same Gentile came before Hillel. He converted him, and said to him, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Go study. That's the story. So in other words, here you have another story that highlights that this concept, he doesn't say the same phrase. The verse says in the positive, love your fellow as yourself. Hillel says it's to the Gentile in the negative. That which is hateful to you, do not do to somebody else. But in any case, he says that's the whole Torah and the rest is commentary. So this is just a way to get into this discussion, because this is interesting. This is an interesting point, because let's think about this for a second. Love your fellow as yourself. Is it the whole Torah? So on the surface, it sounds like, yes, it's the whole Torah, because so many of the mitzvahs of the Torah are mitzvot about social conduct, how to treat other people. We saw that in this parasha as well, to give charity, not to cheat, to be honest with other people. So yeah, what you don't want done to you, don't do to others. That is the whole Torah. But the problem is that there's a big section in the Torah, many commandments in the Torah, that have nothing to do with how you treat other people. They have to do with how you treat your relationship with God. Not to serve idols, and there's so many, all the mitzvot that we do, all the quote unquote religious commandments that we do, to put on tefillin, eat matzah on Passover, et cetera, et cetera. We do so many things that have nothing to do with treating other people. It's about us and God. So how could Hillel tell this Gentile that if you want to know the whole Torah, you should just don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself? So this is a problem in the story, a question on the story. There are all kinds of interesting interpretations. Some are more creative than others. One interpretation that Rashi offers, because Rashi had a commentary not just on the Chumash, not just on the Bible, but also on the Talmud. Rashi says, well, the verse says, love your fellow as yourself. And Hillel said, what is hateful to your friend, what is hateful to you, don't do to your friend. So God said, so Rashi says, okay, one of your friends is God. God is also your friend. He quotes a verse from Proverbs that says, don't abandon your friend, and don't abandon the friend of your parents. And the meaning over there is don't abandon God. So yes, how we treat God is also under the umbrella of how we treat God is also under the umbrella of how we treat other people. That's Rashi's interpretation. But there are other interpretations, and the other interpretations are also interesting. So I want to go through another interpretation or two. Then I'll give to what I really want to do is give the Hasidic interpretation, which you probably heard, but it's always good to hear again. Okay, what is the other interpretation? The other interpretation is, it's not really that this is the entire Torah, right? It's only half the Torah, as we said, right? How you don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself, meaning treat other people with the way you want to be treated. But in other words, the idea that how you relate to other people is only half the Torah. What's the other half of the Torah? The other half of the Torah is premised on the concept of belief in God. And indeed, the Talmud says that there was another prophet named Habakkuk, and Habakkuk quotes a verse and says that the entire Torah is one principle, belief in God. So what's the Torah's principle? Is the Torah's principle, what's the main principle? Don't do to others what you don't want done to yourself? Or is it belief in God? What's the answer? So one answer is, what we're going to just give right now, is that it's really both. And why is that interesting? Because if you look back at the verse that we read, and this is one of the verses that people stop the verse too early. It's a very famous verse, but nobody knows the second half of the verse. What does the verse say? The verse says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So this verse is really talking about both principles. Love your fellow as yourself is the core, is the main point, is the essential point of all the mitzvot between man and fellow person. But Ani Hashem, I am the Lord, is the core. Faith in God is the core of all the mitzvot between one person, a person and God. And therefore, when Hillel said this is the whole Torah, according to this commentator, he didn't just say, he didn't just allude to the first, he alluded to this verse, but he meant also the second half of the verse, which is love your fellow as yourself, I am the Lord. So that's another interpretation. And when I saw from this interpretation, I saw a very interesting commentary. The commentary says like this: if you look at in the book of Exodus when it discusses the different vessels of the temple. And we know that in some sense, the most important vessel was the ark, because the ark was in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place within Judaism. And the ark housed the Torah. The 10 Commandments were in the ark. And also there was a Torah next to the ark, or in the ark, depending on which opinion you follow. But in any case, the ark had a covering. What was the covering? If you remember the picture, the cherubim. The cherubim is two forms of angels or humans, one male, one female, facing each other. So the Torah defines how do the coverings look. They face each other, but their wings spread upward. That's how the Torah defines it. Let me see if I can get a quick picture. Okay, I'm just going to share the screen to share a quick picture of the cherubim, so you know what I'm talking about. I'm sure you know anyway, but just it's nicer on the eyes. Okay, so this is, what's the best picture here? I guess we'll just pick one. Okay, cherubim of gold. This is it. Okay, is this a picture? Not a great picture. It's not big. Okay, you get the point. The point is here. We'll use this picture as a way to open just the picture if I can figure out how to do it. But in any case, okay, you get the point. Pictures are not working out this morning. You get the point. The point is you have the covering over the ark. There are two images or people or angels facing each other. Their wings are spread upward and they face each other. That's the requirement. Knafeim lamaila, persim kanfehem. They're spreading their wings upward and they're facing each other. And that again is the image that you have within the Holy of Holies, the most important part of Judaism. Now we say this, what is an image? We discussed this in the past. An image is not an image of God because God has no image. The image is what we have to what we have to become. So the Kli Yakar says a beautiful commentary. He says, if you look at the ark, what do you see? Ark is the house of the Torah. What do you see? You see people. And these people are doing two things. They're facing each other, number one, and their wings are heavenward. Says the Kli Yakar, that is the two essential points of the Torah. Two essential points is how you relate to the person across you. That is the mitzvot between man and fellow man. And then it's the seeking to go upward, and that's the wings heading upward, seeking to go upward. That is the other set of mitzvot, the mitzvot between person and God. And that is why, that is why we have this image, because yes, there's not one principle, there are two principles. Okay, now I have 3 minutes left, and unfortunately I have to end on time, but I want to give you the Hasidic Commentary. The Hasidic Commentary appears in the Book of Tanya, the founding book of Hasidic philosophy, in chapter 32. 32 is the numerical value of lev, of heart, and the Hasidim would say, this is the heart of the Tanya. This is the heart of the Hasidic movement. So in chapter 32, Rabbi Shneur Zalman asks a simple question. How could Hillel tell the Gentile that this principle, what is hateful to you, do not do to others, is the entire Torah and everything else is commentary? And Rabbi Shneur Zalman articulates the question we've been asking. Yes, I understand that how you not to treat others the way you don't want to be treated is the core of the mitzvot between person and person. But how does that express the mitzvah between person and God? And here is what Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, which is absolutely fascinating, which is brings up the broader question: could you love your fellow as yourself? We didn't get into that. And many commentaries say it's impossible. They say you cannot love your fellow as yourself. You can't. So what is the Torah saying? Torah is not saying love your fellow as yourself. It says love, literally love to your fellow as your love, comma, to your fellow as yourself. You have to love, and therefore, to your fellow means act toward your fellow as you want to be acted to. But by this interpretation, it's impossible to love your fellow as yourself because you're yourself. That person's another person. There's no way you can love your fellow as yourself. That's the conventional interpretation. Nachmanides says that, and others say that as well. Comes the Hasidic interpretation of Rabbi Shneur Zalman and says, of course, let's see. Could you love your fellow as yourself? Question mark. Answer, it depends how you define self. Everybody has a body and soul. If you define yourself primarily as a body, yeah, I'm a physical person. I also have a soul, of course. The soul gives me life. But primarily, I'm a physical entity. Then there's no way, and therefore my friend is also a body, also a physical entity. There's no way you can love your fellow as yourself because the other person is not you, and you're obviously closer to yourself than to your friend, and the other person is the other. And you can never love your fellow, the other as yourself. That's all if I classify myself as a physical entity. What happens if I self-identify not by my body, but by my soul, my spiritual side? And therefore, when I look at you, what am I seeing? I'm not seeing your body, or maybe also I'm seeing your body, but not primarily. I'm seeing, when I look at you, primarily I see your soul. So are you a soul with a body or a body with a soul? Am I a soul with a body or a body with a soul? This is a very important question. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, if I self-identify as a soul and I see you as a soul, then you could love your fellow as yourself, because in the soul level, we're one. So if I primarily identify myself with my body, what is important to me in this world is physical matters, I could never love my fellow as myself. But if what's important to me, what's critical to me is my soul, and I self-identify as a soul, my soul, your soul are one, they come from the same source, they're made of the same stuff, then I could love my fellow as yourself. Which is a very, very thought-provoking idea, profound. Now we come full circle to the original question. How could you say that loving your fellow as yourself is the entire Torah? Because loving your fellow as yourself can only be done if you self-identify as a soul. In other words, you make the soul the primary part of your life, and the body is just serving the soul. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, that is the entire point of the Torah, of every part of the Torah, every mitzvah, fasting on Yom Kippur, eating matzah on Pesach, it doesn't matter what mitzvah you count. Every mitzvah, the purpose of every mitzvah is to understand the primacy of your soul over your body, that you're essentially, you're a spiritual person, you're a spiritual entity, and the body just serves the spiritual entity. And since that's the purpose of the entire Torah, then to love your fellow as yourself, which can only be done by self-identifying as a soul and connecting to the other person on the soul level, then indeed loving your fellow as yourself is the core of the entire Torah. So there's a lot more to say. Well, we're studying on Friday, we're studying Tanya, we're up to chapter 20. In a few weeks, in a few months, we'll be at chapter 32. So we can get more elaboration on that then. But in the meantime, don't forget to love your fellow as yourself, meaning don't forget to understand and relate and realize that you are primarily a soul, and all the physical things you have in this world and all your physical needs and desires are here just to serve your true self, your true identity. Your true identity is your spiritual soul. So that is the message for today. Have a wonderful day. It looks like it's going to be, finally, the spring is here. So that's good. Nothing else to say. We should meet up in good health. And don't forget to be holy. And be holy means to bring the inspiration to every area of life, as we discussed throughout this entire parsha. Thank you.